For more on that top story, the Pentagon released a fact sheet detailing guidelines for its defense cooperation with the Philippines. And earlier, CNA's Chan Yu spoke to Derek Grossman. He's a senior defense analyst at RAND Corporation. And she started by asking him what stood out from that document and the challenges surrounding sharing real-time defense information.
Well, Derek, the guidelines point to increasing interoperability between both sides. It's something Beijing would obviously want to avoid, but isn't altogether unexpected. What stands out to you in the document?
Yeah, so I think that many of the things in the bilateral defense guidelines between the U.S. and the Philippines are very similar to things that we've seen in the past. One thing that did stand out to me, which I thought was pretty interesting, was the idea that the U.S. was going to share additional intelligence with the Philippines. I mean, one can assume that the U.S. has already been sharing intelligence with the Philippines, but the language in the BDG sounded like a much more robust sharing relationship was about to transpire between the two. And that would, I think, significantly help the Philippines in terms of improving its maritime domain awareness capabilities, or MDA capabilities. And this really allows Manila to have a much better picture of what's going on in the South China Sea, and potentially in real time, so that they can respond to incidents that infringe upon their sovereignty in the region.
It sounds simple enough on paper, but what are the challenges involved in sharing real-time information, and are the systems and infrastructure in place for this?
So, yeah, I mean, as a former analyst in the U.S. intelligence community, I can tell you that we used to share regularly with foreign governments, and I'm sure that the intelligence community of today still does. But there are inevitably difficulties in doing so, the level of classification and the type of information that can be shared. But what it sounds like from the BDG is that these issues have been sorted out, at least, for a certain level of classification and certain type of information, that being, related to the South China Sea. And so I think I think it's a good sign that it appeared in the document. I don't think they would mention something that they were still unsure of when they're mentioning it so publicly like that. And in terms of infrastructure, that can always be a challenge. But again, the alliance now dates back to 1951, so they've had a lot of time to figure this out. So I'm pretty confident that they have done so.
And Derek, the Philippines has been firm in saying that its territories will not be used as a staging point for any military action. But given their defense cooperation looks like it's going to be a lot more tight-knit, it seems like a delicate balance. Will this be a complication for either side?
Yeah, so it's interesting. Ever since the announcement that the U.S. and the Philippines would expand the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement, or the EDCA, bases from 5 to 9, and these are bases where Philippine bases where the U.S. can pre-deploy military equipment and rotational troops and conduct joint trainings from these bases and do construction on these bases. There's a variety of different benefits that are afforded to both sides. But ever since that announcement, Marcos has been taking some flack domestically for it. And as he was boarding his flight to come to Washington, D.C., he specifically mentioned that the bases would be used for defensive purposes only and would not be used as launching pads to conduct offensive strikes against potential adversaries. And so, yes, it is a pretty delicate thing. And I think that there is a disagreement, perhaps, with the Biden administration, although when Biden and Marcos met the other day at the White House, they tried to paper over those differences and basically not bring up those differences. But the difference being is that Marcos wants those EDCA bases for defensive purposes only, to not, potentially draw the Philippines into an unnecessary war led by the United States, or more about the United States and its interests than about the Philippines. But Biden and the Biden administration clearly want EDCA to deal with issues that may not directly relate to the Philippines, such as China attacking Taiwan to the north of the Philippines. I'd imagine it's still going to have an impact on the Philippines, but perhaps not a direct impact the way it would in terms of U.S. interests vis-a-vis Taiwan.
Okay, and Derek, rhetoric aside, what sort of reaction do you expect from Beijing after the release of this document?
I honestly, I expect very little reaction from Beijing because Beijing's already, frankly, reacted a lot and to things that are of greater significance than this particular document. The expansion of the EDCA bases from 5 to 9, Beijing was very upset about that and expressed its frustration with the Philippines. I mean, look, they had their moment when Duterte was president from 2016 to 2022. Rodrigo Duterte was the most anti-American and pro-Chinese president of the Philippines perhaps ever. All right. And so if they could not capitalize on that moment to bring the Philippines into their strategic orbit and try to at least loosen the screws of the U.S. Philippines alliance, right? They had an opportunity to do that, and it was a missed opportunity. And so now you have Marcos in place, who is doing the exact opposite of Duterte on China policy and on U.S. policy. So distancing himself from China and cozying up with Washington. So, I think the overall kind of trends are very worrisome, for Beijing and frustrating for Beijing as well.
And a lot of countries will be paying very close attention to this. What do you think is the possibility that this development could prompt other nations who have competing claims in the SCS to look to perhaps bolster their security cooperation with Washington?
Yeah, I think the Philippines is a very unique situation because the Philippines is obviously a security ally of the United States, but other countries in the South China Sea who have, competing claims against China, they are not allies of the United States. So those are Malaysia, Vietnam, Brunei, and Indonesia. Although they're not an official maritime counterclaimant, they certainly have a disagreement with China on the southernmost dash of their 9-dash line in the Natuna Sea, right? So I would count them as well. And so none of these countries are allies of the United States. And so there is no expectation either way, the United States toward them or their views toward the United States, right, that they would experience the same level of support that the United States provides to the Philippines, right, or that they would give the same level of access and support to potential U.S. military operations in the future for something that's not of direct interest. For example, if China attacks Taiwan, right, the Philippines may support with bases in their country, but there's no expectation whatsoever that the Vietnamese would allow the U.S. access to their bases to do something against China in a China-Taiwan scenario. So it's just kind of apples and oranges at this point. The Philippines really does stand alone as an ally of the United States in that regard.
Okay, one last question, Derek. To what extent are China's gray zone tactics driving the Marcos Jr. administration closer to embracing defense cooperation with Washington? And do you expect this to strengthen even further under Mr. Marcos?
Yeah, so I mean, China's been engaging in gray zone operations in the South China Sea for many years now. And just for the viewers, gray zone operations it's essentially in between war and peacetime, right? And it's essentially winning a war without firing a shot. So what China has been doing for the last several years is using its Coast Guard and its fishing militia, and yes, you heard me correctly, a fishing militia, fishermen who are armed and who conduct surveillance in disputed areas, they set up a de facto operating zone, and then they essentially challenge any adversary to remove them from that area. And if you try to remove them by force, then the onus is on you. You've started a war, right? But if you don't, then they own it, right? They own the disputed area. So that is what's been happening for years now, vis-a-vis the maritime counterclaimants, to include the Philippines. And, you can see this most notably at V2/Pag-asa Island, which is a Philippine de facto controlled island with civilians living there. They can actually see Chinese fishing militia and Coast Guard in the waters surrounding them. It's pretty threatening behavior. You can also see this at Second Thomas Shoal, where the Philippines has a ship that they intentionally crashed there years ago to claim sovereignty over that feature in the South China Sea, and they regularly have to resupply it. And the Chinese try to stop the resupply by doing things that, again, are not firing a shot, but doing things that would interfere with with the resupply mission, such as using a laser to blind them. So anyway, these are things that Marcos has actually said literally keep him up at night and worry him every day, and that the problem's actually getting worse by the day. So I think it's a huge driving factor for him to strengthen his alliance with the United States to deal with it.